these types of interfaces serve a purpose beyond just user experience and niceness. Making the process of an application form or a registration or a consultation digital as quick, efficient, seamless, and as least error-prone as possible, or actually all money savers, the revenue-generating things. Obviously, if you shorten the time, for example, in our case, that advisors are able to complete consultations, and that's literally a time saver, which is literally just more money, to be simply put. And at the end of the day, that's what we're here for. So I realized it's actually quite important to solve this problem with that in mind. With the I kind of approach this with quite strict business in mind. We're trying to make all my decisions based on like cost and benefit, and really understanding what I was doing things for, rather than just building stuff, which is what I've done previously. I've built quite a few chatbots now. None of them are actually useful in any way, but they were really fun to make. And the learning was useful. Obviously, you can use that for an array of different things. So I guess I'll try and start by some of the things I'd done previously with chatbot development or conversational UI. And traditionally, I think you guys will all be familiar with, since I'm woefully underprepared for this, let me just actually look it up now. Okay, yeah, so API.ai, which I know you've used, Pete, probably a few others of you have used that before, but essentially this allows the abstraction of a lot of the machine learning capability that goes on when building a conversational or something that understands text. And actually I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute as well. And to cut to the chase, I chose not to go down this route of calling an external service to do some of the machine learning processing for me and getting that response and using that for my app. And the reason I didn't want to do that is because previously when I've used a few things like API.ai, I've also used Personality Bot before. Even as an interface, I've used Facebook Messenger, chatbot interface to develop a chatbot. All these things are quite heavy cost in terms of learning an abstraction pattern or paradigm that I found quite dense. And it's quite a big investment to say, okay, well, I'm going to learn this approach to conversation that is essentially an opinion, because this is a new industry, right? There are no standard patterns and definitions. And these things like entities and intent extraction, none of these things are standardized yet. The things essentially that we've created to abstract some of the complexity of the lower level things that are going on. And I'm just very careful about investing into someone else's opinion of how things should go. Although I would recommend playing with all these tools. They're really great. A lot of these work incredibly well. AI particularly is actually quite intuitive, but I wanted to challenge myself and say, right, let's not use too much stuff to do the heavy lifting for me. So I think a good starting point was trying to find a scenario or a product that might be nice to build a prototype on, and that's what I did essentially. I built a little conversational user interface prototype using some of the great stuff that I've learned while I've been here so far in my long time here. And that really helps me with a lot of the decision making into not just design decisions, but understanding how to architecture the application in a way that would help me write it in a quick way. Because I only had a day to write the bulk of the code. I spent a few days after that making it look pretty, which is a lot of work actually. So I chose to go for the experience of that I think Money Wizard, I think that's what we call it, aims to provide the user. So that's essentially, you have a application form that captures a bunch of data about your user, and we use some process in the background to generate some solution or some document, some asset, some process, which is obviously quite a well understood pattern for web applications. But the new thing, how do we model conversation into that? And I think that was key. So I started very ambitious with my UX plans, and I thought, okay, what's the first thing I can do? Well, I think if we're going to try and go and optimize the user experience, the best thing to do would probably be to build some sort of Neuralink headset that would read the user's brain and feed that into our API, which would then automatically generate our reports. I quickly found out that was quite a heavy investment in terms of development resources and time and intelligence that I don't yet possess, or probably will never possess. But starting from this unrealistic sort of golden scenario is still useful, I think. And that's kind of what I think I learned most from this day, actually, is to try and approach things from first principles, or what we're actually trying to do here. We're trying to maximize the user experience, given that there's some cost for developing that experience, and you have to measure the cost versus the benefit. So I kind of came up with this, so I'll demo this quickly, since it's kind kind of the crux of it. So it's a little front end. Kojo. So that sort of just guides you through the process. sam@gmail.com. So it's not quite as smart as I wish it was, so we're going to make some edits. Cool. I'd say it was quite high. Okay. So that's basically it. I kind of came up with a few different segments of the conversation. I broke those into divisions that I've constructed by page. So you'll actually notice I'm going to different routes here. So if you look at the URL, when I go to that second step, it's email, or when I go to that third step, it's A to R, which is obviously stands for attitude to risk. So just to provide a bit more context, I'm realizing I'm being filmed, and I'm just showing a bunch of stuff that a lot of people won't know is happening. But you capture the user's name, some details, correspondence details. The second stage might be to capture a different context of those correspondence details, perhaps email, etc., your address. And the last bit, which is obviously the most interesting bit, is the capturing of that weird, sort of ambiguous data set. Yeah, it's working. So the last bit is probably the most interesting bit because I'm actually using a little bit of machine learning there, whereas the rest is kind of using older paradigms of user interfaces. And I'll talk about that quickly because I think that's probably the crux of the work. So if we look peek into the code, as you'll see, first of all, I can't stress how simple this was to set up. I'm not using that many frameworks. All the dependencies for this entire thing encompass, I think, 4 packages. So that's Express, which I don't actually need to use. It's just I'm familiar with the API for HTTP servers. Natural, which is a natural language processing node module, and the last one, which is a bit more subtle, is socket.io. Where is that? There it is. Which is I'm using for WebSockets connection with my client. And that's it, nothing else. No external API HTTP calls I have to manage, no database persistence, there was a very little headache to do this. I'm not even using React for my components, they're just flat HTML files, a bit of styling, and a lot of the work that went into this was actually just because I'm a terrible designer, making it look okay. But the actual logic, incredibly easy to use. The classifier does a lot of work for you, but I really like this approach because it didn't force me to learn all these things that essentially people's opinions of how to manage complexity. I had a very strict use cases. I defined those well. I had requirements, and I had the sort of cost-benefit in mind of the day, so I can't spend all day creating this amazing golden standard of everything. And that can be applied, I think, in general to software development. Sometimes I think I definitely fall into making the mistake of trying to achieve this perfect golden application that actually, when you actually take into account the cost of developing it, you lose all the benefit. And I think that's really important to remember when you're designing conversational user interfaces. This use case. What are you doing? This wasn't for me. This wasn't about AI or even natural language processing so much. It was about modeling conversation in a way that's intuitive and easy for the user. And things like dividing the conversation into pages actually helped me massively. So it meant that, for example, for this title page, I didn't have to manage the complexity. So it's just one page. So if we run that index.html, all of that at the top is styling, and the actual work goes into. I have skipped quite an important bit. So these text boxes, I'm using a framework to generate those. And when I say text boxes, I just mean the bubbles, the style, not the content, not the logic. Just because, again, another glowing thing about conversational UI for me was the fact that it took away a lot of the complexity that comes with managing UI away from me. I found myself focusing more on the flow of the conversation, which is the important thing, right? That's what the user is experiencing. I was literally managing the flow of information, which is really all applications do. It's, you communicate, you'd like a registration of your account. That's what we're always communicating things with interfaces. I really enjoy developing this because it allowed me to focus on that solely. The UI is obviously restricted by this format, which we're all intuitive. It's all intuitive to everyone. We all know chat. So many applications now are essentially chat-based. I don't know how familiar you guys are with like Airbnb or Monzo, even some onboarding process, but they have like chat experience for that. And they sort of contain these experiences in conversational modules. And that's another sort of important thing that I got from this, is like the segregation and separation work. And that's what I was just about to illustrate there with these pages. So what that allowed me to do in terms of code, and please forgive the quality of this code because obviously I had a day to do this, so I kind of hacked it together. But it allowed me to not worry about the overall conversation context, which, as you can imagine, managing all three of those steps in one sort of thread of execution and logic would be a bit of a nightmare. But I didn't have to do that. I could just focus on sub-modules. And you could make that even smaller. You could have little modules to manage just literally queries and answers. And in terms of managing some of the wider context, some of the more ambiguous stuff about this state of data, which is all this is at the end of the day, that's all done in one place, which is the server, right? So as I said, I'm using this package here, this Mysterio package called Natural, which gives me a base classifier, which is what I'm using to do that last bit of classification there when I'm asking the application, what is my attitude, sorry, I'm telling the application what my attitude to risk is, and it's telling me it's giving me a score based on what I'm telling it. So it's quite simple and really intuitive to read, I think. I'm training this classifier, giving it some examples of what a low risk score is, giving that score, a medium one, a high one. It essentially, without getting too deep into the complexity of it, although I would recommend reading if you're interested, but essentially it kind of creates numeric representations of these sentiments or these sentences. First, it tokenizes them into atomic segments that it can recognize, then creates this sort of feature vector model. Then when it compares against new data, it has this probabilistic guess of what the closest sort of classification of that is. That's a lot more complicated than I've explained it, and I've explained it in the best way, but essentially this API gives you all the abstraction you actually need to fulfill the requirement which I had, which again, going back to this concept of use case and purpose, I think this was optimal given the parameters that I had. And quite simple. I train the classifier, and when I get an attitude to a risk score message in my socket client, because obviously this is now bidirectional, the server talks to your client just as your client talks to your server, I can classify what that input was in text, I get a score, and I can return that to my client. And also this paradigm of managing the state on the server. So I have a profile state here, which I'm constantly updating when I get new data. Also took away a lot of the complexity of designing the UI, because I didn't have to really worry about what was happening in terms of the actual conversation. My HTML files just worry about representing what's being displayed. So things like just generating a message, easy as that. I'm using, as I said, that framework, message, add, and it's just the content of the message. I don't need to plug in the context of the wider conversation and do all that away in another place. And this reminded me a lot of some of the benefits and principles we've benefited from microservices and just segmentation of responsibilities and all the sort of good software development principles that I think we've all come to benefit and enjoy. But, sorry, let me just fix this. Okay, great, okay. So, in closing, I think I'll just demo a few more of the permutations of what that journey, because when I first demoed it, I think obviously I went through a happy case, but I've encompassed a little bit of uncertainty in that. It's a little bit too keen, so. John. Okay, so earlier this morning, Joe made a really good point that a large worry for me about these sort of systems is that you become very susceptible to user errors because you have to make the very careful judgment of not assuming that everything the user says is valid. So I kind of had that approach when I was doing this. I was like, okay, I have to assume that the user could be crazy, that they might not speak English, my system might not interpret them in the right way. So I kind of had to blend a few UI components into one. This isn't just a chatbot. It's really, for me, it's an application that utilizes chat components, it uses traditional components, and it uses all of these together to form that optimal sort of user experience. And that can be displayed by, obviously I'm using buttons as well as like a progress tracker and things like this. So in terms of, that's perfect, that's exactly what I wanted. So the email's wrong, you can edit it manually, emails go away. Let's skip to the last bit as well. Random stuff. Okay, and you'll notice, as I said, it's kept the state from what I had previously. So this is great because even if you close this application, you can go in between pages still in one state because obviously I'm managing all about the server. I don't have to worry about that extra complexity of the imprecision and the weirdness of browsers and the magical things that can happen on the front end. But as I said, if you need to make traditional UI elements, I think that's almost a compulsory part of creating actually a full conversational user interface. Is allowing the user to have choice and allowing for mistakes and utilizing some of the good bits about traditional interfaces as well as some of the more forward-thinking bits of chatbot experiences. So obviously, if things go wrong, go for it, enter all your details as you would normally. Thank you, Bootstrap, for that. And you still get to the same outcome. You go back into the chat-like interface. And again, I really enjoy sort of blending the two, so you can sort of go here and go to whatever the chat you actually want to go to. But just that blend of experiences and really thinking about how you'd want to model your conversation in a way that's intuitive to the user. I think that's what guided this for me. That's the thing I learned most, is understanding fundamental principles, what you're trying to design, and really thinking carefully about how to design it that way. And being careful also about when not to use things like classification algorithms and what type of classification algorithms. I spent a lot of time actually on this day doing a bit of sort of lower level machine learning. So one of the potential variations of this was using Python sklearn to do classification, which would allow me to train some of my test data in a slightly more rigorous way and tweak parameters. But again, this sort of cost-benefit analysis I kept doing led me to just realize that this was not optimal for what I was trying to achieve in one day. It might be in the longer term if you're productionizing this out, but having that period of investigation definitely guided some of the decisions that I made later on. I'm not going to go too deeply into this because I think that's probably the topic for another talk, and I'm still working through it. This notebook that I'm putting together kind of analyzes different ways to classify text and different approaches that you can use sklearn for. But it was really useful for me to just learn. That's what the day was about, the other thing. And in terms of bot UI, which is the framework that I was using, as I said, it's really simple. You can essentially just define messages that you can display whenever you want. You get an awaitable, which is optional. You don't have to use this, this is just a promise. You'll all be familiar with this if you're Node writers. And obviously, one of the great things about this as well is we can use modern tools like React actually to make this even simpler. You can use async await to represent this and not have this sort of indentation of blocks. There's just so many ways you could improve what I did, and even though I'd say it was okay for a day, but there's so many improvements that can be made with a lot of different practices. And yeah, I think I'll end it there. That's just about half an hour, but I'm happy to hear questions and things that people want to hear more about. Yeah, that's it.
Cool.